Arkansas is a state with crimes as shocking as they are tragic. In this video, we revisit notorious murder cases that scarred the natural state. Among them are three young men, Charles Jason Baldwin Damien Echols and Jesse L. Miscali Jr., whose convictions would later be exposed as a miscarriage of justice. But the rest were true killers whose crimes left entire communities in fear. It was a sunny Monday morning in early June of 2009 when the city of Little Rock, Arkansas would suddenly become the stage for a chilling act of violence. At a U.S. Army recruiting office on North Rodney Parham Road, two young soldiers, Private William Andrew Long, 23, and Private Quentin Ferrari Shagula, 18, were standing outside in their uniforms taking a short break and smoking cigarettes. Both had recently completed their basic training and had volunteered to work as recruiters, stepping away from the training grounds into a role of guiding new recruits. They could never have imagined that this ordinary moment would turn deadly. Driving up in a black 2003 Ford Explorer Sport Track, Abdulhakim Mujahid MUHAMMAD, who was born Carlos Leon Bledsoe, rolled into the parking lot. Armed with an SKS rifle, a Mossberg International 702 rifle, two handguns, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, Muhammad approached the soldiers and opened fire. Private Long was hit multiple times and died at the scene, while Private Eziogula sustained gunshot wounds to his back, head, and buttocks, barely clinging to life as he crawled towards safety. Witnesses later recounted hearing the sharp cracks of gunfire and seeing the truck speed away with the tailgate down, bottles of water spilling onto the pavement. It was a scene of chaos and horror. Muhammad's attempted escape was short-lived. He had planned to drive 150 miles to Memphis to switch vehicles, but a wrong turn in a construction zone led local police to intercept him just 8 miles from the scene. Surrendering without resistance, he stepped out of his vehicle wearing a green ammunition belt and boldly declared, "There's a war going on against Muslims, and that is why I did it." He claimed affiliation with jihad and stated that he had explosives, though none were found. In his car and apartment, law enforcement discovered not only firearms and ammunition, but also homemade sound suppressors, Molotov cocktails, military books, and literature connected to extremist ideology. But to understand why Muhammad carried out such a cold-blooded act, we need to look deeper into his life and radicalization. Born in Memphis, Tennessee on July 9, 1985, he grew up in a Baptist household with his parents Melvin and Linda Bledsoe and a sister named Monica. Friends and family described him as a bright, sunny child. He graduated from Craigmont High School in 2003 and attended Tennessee State University in Nashville for 3 semesters. At the age of 19, he converted to Islam at a local mosque, Masjid as-Salam, and began taking his faith very seriously. By 2007, he had legally changed his name to Abdulhakim Mujahid MUHAMMAD and traveled to Yemen to teach English, study Arabic, and immerse himself further in Islamic teachings. It was during this time, according to his own letters, that he became influenced by radical elements and began planning attacks against the United States. While in Yemen, he married Rina Abdullah Ahmed Farag, a local teacher, though he was deported back to the United States after overstaying his visa and being detained with a fraudulent Somali passport. Muhammad claimed in his handwritten letters sent between May and October of 2010 that he had been approached multiple times in Yemen to carry out a martyrdom operation in America, but lacked training in explosives. He allegedly attempted to travel to Somalia for bomb-making instruction, but his arrest in Yemen thwarted those plans. Once back in the United States, he settled briefly with his parents in Memphis before moving to Little Rock, where his father helped him find employment. Despite returning to the U.S., his fixation on jihad persisted. He reportedly conducted reconnaissance on multiple military, government, and Jewish sites across the country, including New York, Atlanta, Louisville, and Philadelphia, and even attempted attacks on religious figures. When Muhammad was finally indicted, he faced charges of capital murder, attempted capital murder, and multiple counts of unlawful discharge of a weapon. Prosecutors initially pursued the death penalty given the brutality and premeditation of his attack. Yet in January of 2010, Muhammad, without consulting his lawyers, changed his plea to guilty. In his letters, he proclaimed his actions as part of the mission of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, claiming to be a soldier following Islamic law to fight those he perceived as enemies of Islam. He wrote extensively about his motives, stating that he believed American military actions in the Middle East justified the deaths of soldiers stationed in his home country. The defense had argued that Muhammad suffered from delusional disorder, that he was unable to process reality, and that his claims of al-Qaeda affiliation might have been a means of martyrdom fantasy rather than an actual operational link. Despite these claims, the Pulaski County prosecutor accepted the guilty plea, and on July 25, 2011, Muhammad was sentenced to life in prison. His writings and interviews reveal a young man whose trajectory from a seemingly normal childhood to radicalized violence underscores the complexities of domestic extremism in the post-September 11th era. The case also ignited discussions on domestic radicalization and the role of overseas influences on homegrown terrorism. Muhammad's father, Melvin Bledsoe, testified before Congress in March of 2011, warning that if it could happen to his son, it could happen to anyone. He emphasized that the United States must confront the growing threat of radical extremists who exploit young Americans' vulnerabilities. The Little Rock recruiting office shooting, while perhaps less notorious than other attacks in the United States during 2009, including the Fort Hood shooting later that year, remains a stark reminder that the reach of radical ideology can turn ordinary citizens into instruments of violence. The memory of Private Long and the bravery of Private Izagula endure, as do the ongoing conversations about how society identifies and addresses threats before they materialize. Muhammad remains incarcerated, a vivid example of the deadly consequences when ideology, opportunity, and mental instability converge. Andrew Douglas Golden was only 11 years old when his name became forever linked with one of the darkest chapters in American school history. His accomplice, Mitchell Scott Johnson, was just 13. Together they carried out the West Side Middle School Massacre in Jonesboro, Arkansas, a tragedy that shocked the nation in March of 1998. Before that fateful day, both boys lived seemingly ordinary lives, yet beneath the surface were signs of instability, resentment, and a growing fascination with violence that would erupt in an unimaginable act. Golden came from what many described as a stable, loving household. He spent time with his parents and grandparents and was raised to be comfortable with firearms from a very young age. His father gave him his first gun when he was only 6 years old, and hunting trips were a common part of his upbringing. But classmates recalled a different side of Andrew. He was often a bully, quick to fight, and even accused of cruelty toward animals. One student claimed he had shot her cat with a BB gun. Mitchell Johnson's life was more turbulent. His parents divorced when he was 7, and although his mother later remarried, he struggled with identity and belonging. To adults, he appeared quiet and respectful, but peers described him as a bully who boasted about gang life and drugs. He openly expressed grudges, especially against one of his teachers, Shannon Wright. Johnson's troubled background included disturbing allegations of abuse when he was a child, and later he himself was accused of inappropriate behavior toward younger children. These elements painted a picture of a boy deeply at odds with himself and others. The massacre itself was chilling in both planning and execution. On the evening before the attack, Golden and Johnson loaded a Dodge Caravan with weapons, food, and supplies. The next day, Golden pulled the school's fire alarm, sending teachers and students pouring into the yard as if for a routine drill. Johnson waited in the woods with rifles, and once Golden rejoined him, the boys opened fire. For several minutes, chaos reigned. Children screamed and ran for cover while teachers tried desperately to shield them. In those few minutes, 4 girls and 1 teacher, Shannon Wright, lost their lives. 10 others, including 9 students and a teacher, were wounded. Some teachers displayed incredible bravery. Wright herself died while protecting a young student named Emma Pittman. Another teacher, Lynette Thetford, was shot while shielding children with her body. Stories of courage emerged from the horror, but the damage was devastating. Police quickly responded, and the boys attempted to flee back to their van in the woods. They were caught almost immediately, still armed and wearing camouflage. The image of 2 children, barely adolescents, being led away in handcuffs left the public stunned. The legal aftermath highlighted gaps in the juvenile justice system. Because of their ages, both were tried as juveniles and could only be held until their 21st birthdays. In August of 1998, they were found guilty of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to juvenile custody. Families of the victims were devastated by the thought that the perpetrators of such carnage could one day walk free while their loved ones never would. Judge Ralph Wilson Jr. admitted that his hands were tied by the law, stating that the punishment felt insufficient given the enormity of the crime. True to the limits of the law, Johnson was released in 2005 on his 21st birthday, and Golden followed in 2007, also on his 21st birthday. Their release drew outrage, with many arguing that justice had not been served. Johnson's life after release was marked by further trouble with the law, including drug charges, theft, and weapons possession, eventually leading to additional prison time. Golden changed his name to Drew Douglas Grant, attempting to escape notoriety, but his attempt to obtain a concealed carry permit exposed his true identity, reminding the public of his past. Psychologists who examined the case noted different dynamics in the boys. Johnson showed signs of deep anger, a need for control, and possible lingering trauma from his early years. Golden, on the other hand, was described as manipulative, impulsive, and fascinated with firearms. Together, they created a deadly partnership where Johnson's resentment merged with Golden's cold willingness to act. Some experts argued that their youth made it difficult to classify them in traditional psychological terms, but their actions revealed a chilling capability for premeditated violence. In reflecting on this tragedy, one cannot help but consider the fragile line between childhood innocence and unthinkable brutality. Teachers who acted heroically that day are remembered as protectors, while the victims' families carry an enduring grief. The words of Judge Wilson during sentencing still resonate. The young men would one day have a future, but those they killed would not. The Westside Middle School massacre stands as a sobering reminder that violence is not confined to adults, and that warning signs in young people must never be ignored. Perhaps the most haunting question is whether the tragedy could have been prevented, whether someone might have noticed the threats, the fascination with weapons, or the festering anger before it was too late. Jacob D. Robida was just 18 years old when he shocked the nation with a violent spree that stretched across multiple states. On the night of February 2, 2006, Robida entered Puzzle's Lounge, a popular gay bar in New Bedford, Massachusetts, dressed entirely in black. After confirming that the bar was indeed for LGBTQ+ patrons, he unleashed a wave of violence, swinging a hatchet at a man from behind. Panic erupted as other patrons struggled to stop him, but Robida was not finished. He pulled out a handgun and fired at 3 more people, seriously wounding them. The attack left the community in shock. 4 people were hurt in total, and authorities immediately treated it as a hate crime. Robida fled the scene driving his green Pontiac over 1,500 miles, heading south with a female companion, Jennifer Rena Bailey, 33, who he had previously lived with in West Virginia. The details of her involvement remain unclear. Some evidence suggested she was coerced, while others debated if she went willingly. Her family insisted she would never leave her 3 young children voluntarily. The escape ended violently in Arkansas. When local police officer Jim Sell attempted a traffic stop in Gassville, Robida shot and killed him. A high-speed chase ensued, and roughly 18 miles later, Robida stopped in Norfolk. There he shot Jennifer at close range before turning the gun on himself. He was airlifted to a hospital in Springfield, Missouri, where he died shortly after. Forensic analysis confirmed that the fatal shot came from his own weapon, revealing a murder-suicide at the end of his deadly journey. Investigators pieced together a disturbing profile. At home in Massachusetts, Robida's bedroom contained an arsenal of weapon hatchets, knives, a samurai sword, a handgun, and dozens of rounds of ammunition. Neo-Nazi posters covered the walls, along with anti-Semitic and anti-gay writings. He had even built a makeshift coffin. Authorities also found a handwritten note described as the desperate message of a young man planning more violence, though it was not formally released. Robida was a high school dropout who embraced extremist ideologies, including neo-Nazism, but friends said he had not expressed direct prejudice toward LGBTQ+ individuals before the attack. He also identified as a juggalo, a follower of the rap group Insane Clown Posse, though ICP quickly condemned his actions, stressing that their fan culture did not condone violence. The victims of the New Bedford bar attack, Robert Perry, Alex Taylor, and Luis Rosado, faced injuries ranging from gunshot wounds to deep lacerations. Robert Perry, a local EMT and father of 4, survived but was forever changed. The attack galvanized the community, drawing attention from local and national civil rights groups and prompting calls for stronger hate crime protections covering sexual orientation. Candlelight vigils were held outside the bar, with residents and activists showing solidarity with the victims. Robida's spree illustrates how dangerous a combination of extremist ideology, isolation, and access to weapons can be even in seemingly ordinary young adults. In just a few days, he transformed from a New Bedford teenager into a nationwide threat, leaving death, injury, and trauma in his wake. The story is a chilling reminder of how quickly violence can erupt and how a community can be forever marked by a single individual's descent into darkness. Jacob D. Robida's life ended at just 18, But the impact of his actions stretched far beyond him, affecting families, law enforcement, and an entire community struggling to comprehend the horror of a young man who once seemed like any other teenager. Gordon Wendell Kahl was born in North Dakota in 1920. A decorated World War II veteran, he served honorably as a turret gunner and even survived being shot down in combat. But after the war, Kahl's life took a darker turn. By the 1970s, he had become a vocal tax protester and a member of the Posse Comitatus movement, a far-right group that rejected federal authority and promoted extreme anti-government beliefs. Once seen as a hardworking farmer and family man, Kahl grew increasingly consumed by his ideology. To some, he was a patriot, standing against what he saw as government tyranny. To others, he was a dangerous extremist waiting to explode. Several triggers shaped Kahl's radical path. Financial difficulties fueled resentment toward the federal government, especially the Internal Revenue Service. He stopped paying income taxes in the 1960s and openly encouraged others to resist as well. His involvement with Posse Comitatus deepened his anti-authority worldview, convincing him that government officials were illegitimate agents of oppression. For Kahl, every confrontation with federal law enforcement reinforced his belief that he was fighting a holy war. That mindset would soon set the stage for deadly violence. On February 13, 1983, federal marshals attempted to arrest Kahl after a tax evasion hearing in Medina, North Dakota. What should have been a routine apprehension turned into a bloodbath. When confronted, Kahl opened fire. In the chaos, 2 U.S. Marshals were killed and several others were wounded. Kahl managed to escape, vanishing into the vast rural landscape. This violent clash shocked the nation, transforming a tax protester into a fugitive, wanted for the murder of federal officers. A massive manhunt began immediately. Roadblocks were set up across the state, helicopters searched farmland, and a $25,000 reward was offered. Despite these efforts, Kahl eluded capture for nearly 4 months. Authorities later traced him to rural Arkansas, where friends had sheltered him. On June 3, 1983, law enforcement surrounded a farmhouse in Lawrence County. Accounts of what happened next remain disputed. Officials reported that Kahl exchanged gunfire with officers, killing Sheriff Gene Matthews before being fatally shot himself. Tear gas canisters ignited a blaze that consumed the farmhouse, leaving Kahl's body burned beyond recognition. Though official autopsies confirmed his identity, rumors persisted that he had somehow escaped and lived on in hiding. Kahl's psychological profile reflects the radicalization of a man unable to reconcile his wartime patriotism with his growing hostility toward authority. His ideology provided him with a sense of mission and moral justification for violence. In his mind, resisting taxes was not just about money, it was about freedom, sovereignty, and defiance against what he saw as corrupt federal power. That conviction blinded him to the real human cost of his actions. His refusal to compromise and his willingness to die for his beliefs positioned him as both martyr and villain, depending on who told the story. The case of Gordon Kahl remains one of the most controversial chapters in American law enforcement history. For some, he is remembered as a domestic terrorist who murdered public servants. For others, he became a symbol of resistance, his death shrouded in myth and conspiracy. Even today, questions linger about how he evaded capture for so long, what truly happened in that Arkansas farmhouse, and whether the government's actions fueled the legend more than it silenced it. In the end, Kahl's story is not just about one man's defiance, but about how extremism left unchecked can escalate into tragedy, leaving behind scars on both families and the nation's memory. In the quiet town of West Memphis, Arkansas, in the spring of 1993, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. But on a single day in May, the town would be plunged into a nightmare that would haunt its residents for decades. 3 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, went missing while playing near their neighborhood. At first, parents hoped the children had merely wandered off or been delayed by friends, but as hours passed without any sign of them, fear began to grow. By the next morning, the search for the boys intensified. Local law enforcement, joined by volunteers and search and rescue teams, combed through the area. It was a neighbor who first reported seeing the boys last around 6 in the evening, but initial police searches that night were minimal. As dawn broke, the searchers focused on the wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills. Hours of searching yielded nothing until a juvenile parole officer, Steve Jones, spotted a lone black shoe floating in a muddy creek. What followed was a scene that would shock the town and the nation. The boys' bodies were discovered bound with their own shoelaces naked and with injuries that fueled panic and speculation. One boy showed signs of severe trauma, which prosecutors would later claim was a knife attack and an attempted castration, though defense experts argued that these were post-mortem injuries caused by animals. In the aftermath, the community demanded answers, and law enforcement turned to the teenagers who in many ways fit the profile of society's outsiders. 17-year-old Jesse Misskelley, junior 16-year-old Jason Baldwin, and 18-year-old Damien Echols became the focus of the investigation. Jesse, who had an IQ of 72 and was considered borderline mentally challenged, was interrogated alone by police for 12 grueling hours. Coercion, intimidation, and fatigue led him to confess, implicating both Baldwin and Echols. The confession, rife with inconsistencies and details that didn't match the crime scene, became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Damien Echols, the eldest of the three, had a troubled past. He had spent time in a psychiatric institution and was diagnosed with severe mental health issues, including delusions, auditory and visual hallucinations, and mood instability. He had been institutionalized in part because of an early relationship that ended in a burglary charge, and he had been prescribed antidepressants. Jason Baldwin, quieter and academically gifted, was drawn into Echols' circle through their shared love of alternative music and literature. Baldwin and Echols were acquainted with Misskelley, but not particularly close. All three maintained their innocence, but the shadow of Jesse's coerced confession loomed large over their lives. From the very beginning, the investigation was flawed. The crime scene was mishandled, contaminated by officials and curious onlookers. Important evidence was lost, including blood samples from the Bojangles restaurant restroom, where a disheveled man, later referred to as Mr. Bojangles, was seen on the night of the murders. Witnesses provided statements under police pressure that would later be recanted, including Vicky Hutchison, who initially claimed that Echols and Misskelley had participated in a satanic ritual killing. Her testimony would later be revealed as entirely fabricated, coerced by law enforcement, threatening to take away her child. The town's panic over alleged satanic activity magnified the fear, creating a climate in which it seemed unthinkable that the accused teenagers could be innocent. In 1994, the trials began. Jesse Misskelley Jr. was tried separately due to the legal rules surrounding his confession. He was convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder, receiving a sentence of life plus 40 years. Echols and Baldwin, tried together, were found guilty of all 3 murders, with Echols sentenced to death and Baldwin to life imprisonment. Appeals followed, but convictions were upheld. The 3 were now imprisoned, the town reassured, and yet a sense of unease lingered in the air, especially among those who believed in the possibility of their innocence. Public attention to the case escalated with the release of the documentaries Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, and its sequel Paradise Lost: Two Revelations. These films highlighted the miscarriage of justice and the flawed investigation, introducing a wider audience to the story and prompting a reevaluation of evidence that had been largely ignored. DNA testing, performed years later, revealed that none of the biological material recovered at the scene matched any of the 3 accused. A hair found in the knots used to bind one of the victims was not inconsistent with Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of one victim. Experts also suggested that some of the wounds on the children could have been caused by animal activity, not human hands. Over time, even families of the victims began questioning the convictions. Pamela Hobbs, mother of Stevie Branch and John Mark Byers, adoptive father of Christopher Byers, publicly voiced doubts. Byers himself would later declare the West Memphis 3 innocent, stating that after reviewing the evidence, he had no doubt they had been wrongfully convicted. These declarations marked a profound shift in the narrative surrounding the case and lent credibility to the growing movement for justice for the accused. After nearly 18 years behind bars, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Misskelley Jr. were released in 2011 through an offered plea, which allowed them to assert their innocence while acknowledging that prosecutors had enough evidence to convict. Their release was a moment of relief and celebration, but it also left lingering questions. Who truly committed the murders? How had such a miscarriage of justice occurred in a small town with a close-knit community? The answers remain elusive, but the case continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the consequences of coerced confessions, flawed investigations, and public hysteria. Today, the story of the West Memphis 3 is remembered not only for the horrors of that spring day in 1993, but also as a cautionary tale. It underscores the importance of due process, the dangers of panic-driven investigations, and the enduring need for vigilance in the pursuit of justice. For Damien, Jesse, and Jason, freedom was ultimately achieved, but the shadow of that night in Robin Hood Hills, in the memory of the three lost children, will never fully disappear. Damien Wayne Echols was 18 years old when the world decided he was a monster. He didn't look like the other boys in West Memphis. He wore black year-round, read books about mysticism, and wrote poetry that spoke of pain and isolation. In a town steeped in evangelical tradition, Damien's appearance alone was enough to spark suspicion. But suspicion became accusation when three 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, were found murdered in Robin Hood Hills. The crime was brutal and the town was terrified. With no clear suspects and no physical evidence, fear turned to folklore. Whispers of satanic rituals and cults filled the air. And Damien, with his trench coat and dark journals, became the perfect villain. He was arrested on June 4, 1993, alongside Jason, Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly. The case against him was built on hearsay teenage gossip and a coerced confession from Miskelly, a boy with limited intellectual capacity who later recanted. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses. But there was a narrative, and Damien fit it. At trial, prosecutors leaned into the image. They painted Damien as a dangerous outsider, obsessed with the occult, and capable of unspeakable violence. His writings were used against him. His clothing became evidence. His beliefs, or what others assumed about them, were treated as motive. On March 19, 1994, Damien was sentenced to death by lethal injection. He was sent to the Varner Unit, a supermax prison in Arkansas, where he would spend the next 18 years in solitary confinement. In a cell barely larger than a walk-in closet, Damien began the slow process of surviving. He studied Buddhism. He meditated for hours each day. Later, he turned to ceremonial magic, not as escape, but as structure, as a way to reclaim control over a life that had been stripped from him. Outside the prison walls, the case began to unravel. Documentaries like Paradise Lost exposed the flaws in the investigation. New DNA testing revealed that none of the genetic material at the crime scene matched Damien or his co-defendants. Instead, a hair linked to Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of one of the victims, was found in the bindings. Witnesses recanted. Jurors were found to have violated protocol. Even some of the victims' families began to question the verdict. In 2011, Damien was offered an Alford plea, a legal maneuver that allowed him to maintain his innocence while acknowledging that the state had enough evidence to convict. It was a bitter compromise, but it meant freedom. After nearly 2 decades on death row, Damien walked out of prison. But freedom came with its own weight. He had missed the entire arc of young adulthood. He had lived in a world where every door was locked, every movement monitored, every breath taken in fear. He had been treated not just as a criminal, but as something less than human. In interviews, Damien has spoken about the trauma, the difficulty of walking without shackles, the panic attacks, the sense of dislocation. He has also spoken about resilience, about how belief, discipline, and love kept him alive. Today, Damien is an author, a speaker, and an advocate for criminal justice reform. He writes about spirituality, trauma, and the power of transformation. He does not dwell on the past, but he does not run from it either. He once said, "They took my body, but they never touched my soul." That line is more than defiance. It's a declaration that even in the darkest corners of the system, even when the world decides who you are before you speak, there is still something no one can take your truth. Damien Echols was not the monster they imagined. He was a teenager, misunderstood and misjudged. And his story is a warning that fear can be louder than facts, and that justice, when built on prejudice, becomes just another form of violence. Jason Baldwin was 16 years old when he was arrested for one of the most infamous crimes in Arkansas history. At the time, he was a quiet teenager living in West Memphis, known for his artistic talent and good grades. He had dreams of studying graphic design, encouraged by a school counselor who saw promise in his sketches. Baldwin lived with his mother and younger brother in a modest home. He wasn't popular, but he wasn't troubled either. Compared to his co-defendants, Damien Echols and Jesse Miskelly Baldwin seemed the least likely to be involved in anything violent. But on June 3, 1993, Baldwin was arrested alongside Echols. The charge, triple homicide. 3 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, had been found murdered in a wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills. The crime scene was disturbing, and the town was shaken. Rumors of satanic rituals and cult activity spread quickly. Baldwin Echols and Miss Kelly were labeled the West Memphis Three. The case against Baldwin was built largely on association. Miss Kelly, who had a reported IQ of 72, confessed after hours of police interrogation, a confession riddled with inconsistencies, and later recanted. In that statement, he implicated Baldwin and Echols. Baldwin, however, maintained his innocence from the beginning. He had no criminal record beyond a minor juvenile offense and no history of violence. But the prosecution leaned heavily on the idea that Baldwin was part of a group influenced by dark beliefs and violent fantasies. The trial was swift. Baldwin and Echols were tried together while Miss Kelly was tried separately. The prosecution presented Miss Kelly's confession despite its contradictions and emphasized Baldwin's friendship with Echols, whose Gothic appearance and interest in occult literature made him a target. On March 19, 1994, Baldwin was convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For years, Baldwin remained behind bars, quietly fighting for justice. In 2007, new DNA testing revealed that none of the genetic material found at the crime scene matched Baldwin Echols or Miss Kelly. Instead, a hair found in the knots used to bind one of the victims was not inconsistent with Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of Stevie Branch. Hobbs had long denied involvement, but the evidence raised serious questions. The case began to unravel. Witnesses recanted. Vicki Hutchison, whose testimony had helped implicate Baldwin, admitted in 2003 that she had fabricated her statements under police pressure. The jury foreman in Baldwin's trial was found to have discussed the case with an attorney before deliberations began violating court protocol. Even John Mark Byers, the adoptive father of Christopher Byers, once a vocal supporter of the convictions, publicly declared that he believed Baldwin and the others were innocent. In November of 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered new evidentiary hearings. The justices cited both the DNA evidence and allegations of jury misconduct. The tide was turning. Public support for the West Memphis Three grew, fueled by documentaries like Paradise Lost and Devil's Knot, which exposed flaws in the investigation and trial. Finally, in August of 2011, Baldwin Echols and Miss Kelly entered Alford pleas, a legal maneuver that allowed them to assert innocence while acknowledging that the state had enough evidence to convict. They were released from prison after more than 18 years behind bars. Jason Baldwin walked out of prison a free man, but not without scars. He had entered as a teenager and emerged in his 30s. Since his release, Baldwin has dedicated himself to criminal justice reform, working to prevent wrongful convictions and support others who've been failed by the system. What drove Baldwin to endure nearly 2 decades of incarceration without bitterness? Perhaps it was his quiet resilience, the same calm strength that defined him before the arrest. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that truth, though delayed, could still prevail. In a later interview, Baldwin reflected, "I would rather spend the rest of my life in prison knowing I'm innocent than be free and have to live with the guilt of a lie." That line lingers. In a case clouded by fear, bias, and broken systems, Jason Baldwin's story is a reminder that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about truth. And sometimes truth takes time. These cases from Arkansas remind us how thin the line can be between justice and tragedy. Some lives were destroyed by wrongful convictions, while others were taken by cold-blooded killers. If you found this deep dive compelling, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the drive to bring you more true crime stories from across America.